Okay, let's get some perspective right now as they go into the DNA from the house. Joining me is law professor Pam Metzger. Professor, great to have you here. DNA is an interesting role in this case. We talked about the bathtub bar, but then there's the presence of unknown DNA, both under the fingernails of one of the victims, Brandy Peters. There was also the potential DNA of a drug smuggler that was found on the phone, unknown male DNA on the spade shovel, and a lack of DNA of the defendant everywhere. So what is your thought? What are your thoughts on the role DNA plays in this case?
I think it's important first to understand that this is the evidence that the prosecution actually sat on until 2015, right? So I think jurors could reasonably have a question even about why it took so long for the DNA evidence to be produced. Once you have DNA evidence, jurors have this sort of CSI effect. They expect that just like they see on TV, there's going to be a whodunit moment where we're going to see the DNA, we're going to know that's the guy. They're not going to get that here. We've got DNA that's partial matches. We've got DNA absences where you would expect someone who was familiar to the victims, right? He's the children's father, he knows the mother. You would expect his DNA to show up somewhere. I think that poses a problem for the prosecution in this case, and it may have been the reason for the 8-4 split we saw in the first trial.
You know, and the thing that's interesting is people might be saying, oh, well, you know, shouldn't his DNA be everywhere? Wasn't he at the house all the time? No. He admitted that he was there the Wednesday before the murders, and he was there ultimately on the day of the murders. But before that, he hadn't been to that house in about a year. So that's just something to consider here. Now, one of the other questions I have, Professor, is let's say he didn't do this, okay? Let's say that he is completely innocent. And if he gets acquitted, we're looking at a guy who spent the last over 3,000 days in jail awaiting these trials. Have his rights been violated in that way? And look, I know there's been a lot of change in Florida law about the death penalty. That's one of the reasons there's been such a delay. But to have a guy who, if he's acquitted, have spent so much time in jail for a crime he didn't commit, what do you think about that?
Well, look, this is one of the great tragedies of our national criminal justice system, that people spend days, weeks, months, years in jail when they are in fact innocent. I mean, legally, he is an innocent man, and he's as innocent today as he was when he was charged. He will not be guilty unless and until a jury votes that he is guilty. And I think this is a real problem in terms of our own internal senses of justice. You can't give those days back to him. If he's an innocent person and at the end of this trial, he's not convicted, if there's another hung jury, at some point, it's my view that we as a country have an obligation to say that's not how our criminal justice system is supposed to work.
And that's the thing to think about here. Again, let's imagine what happens if he's ultimately acquitted, and we'll have that conversation if that should happen at that point. Right now, let's jump back live, if we can, more of the DNA expert. Okay, Professor, as they go into DNA, let's talk about the defense's case here, that it wraps around these other individuals, and it's something straight out of a movie. We talked about that in a way, it could be a danger for the defense that the jury might say, this just seems too unbelievable. You have this guy, James Carlos Santos, who then hires these other people to ultimately carry out the hit. But in your opinion, based upon everything you've seen, it would seem to suggest this is a plausible alternative to what happened, considering the 8-4 split the first time around. What are your thoughts on the defense here?
Yeah, it's always hard to know what a jury was thinking the first time around. Second trials are always tougher for the defense. But here it does seem like there's a plausible alternative theory. It's complicated because Santos, who claims to have committed the murder, is associated with 2 other false confessions to 2 other cases. Where he said he was responsible for ordering or executing a murder. So it's complicated. The jury won't hear all of that, but presumably these are jurors who lived in the community, and even if they can be unbiased and fair, they may have heard things before about the first trial, and it's difficult to know how that plays into the deliberations that they'll eventually have.
And listen, this is an infamous trial. It is the longest running murder case in Tallahassee history, so it'll be difficult. It was difficult to find a jury that didn't know anything about it and ultimately comes in impartial. Okay, so we're learning more about the DNA. I'm I was waiting to hear when they would say, because this is what our understanding is that there was unknown male DNA on that spade shovel that does not match Segura. I'm waiting to hear that from this expert, if that will come out. Professor, how much does a jury ultimately consider DNA evidence? It's 2019. We've seen all the shows. How reliable is it? Do they really hold on to this, especially in a case where there seems to be a lack tying the defendant to the crime scene through DNA?
Yeah. So I think juries look for it a lot. In fact, I think juries often have unrealistic expectations that every case is going to have DNA. The reality is we move through the world and there's DNA on me and on you and all over the place. But jurors don't think that way. I think they look for that aha moment that television has promised them. I think they find moments like we're going to see in this trial where we've got unmatched, unknown DNA, deeply unsatisfying. And I think legitimately may view those as reasonable doubt in the context of a jury verdict, particularly in a case like this, where the parties all know each other and one would expect sort of a smoking gun in that intimate relationship. And there just isn't one here.
Well, the prosecution's trying to build a story here, and we learned earlier today it was all about the motive. And I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of the child support payments. The idea, what we learned earlier, was that yes, he was owing these payments, he did not make these payments, and he was losing certain things by not making these payments, including a driver's license and I believe a welding license. Now, the defense said, okay, that's probably all true, but he still owed another woman child support payments, and even if you got rid of Brandy Peters and the kids, he would have been in the same position. They're going to present their own witness about that. But we did learn from an earlier witness that if Javante was dead, Henry Segura would no longer have to make those payments. So what are you on the motive here in this case?
Yeah, I frankly don't find the motive terribly persuasive. First, as you said, there's other child support due. Second, we're a nation full of people who owe child support. The idea that everyone who owes child support is somehow capable of or invested in committing a murder over $20,000 in back child support strikes me as implausible, particularly when you compare it with the amount of money that Brandy Peters supposedly owes to the drug cartel, which is $100,000. So if we're marking motive, right, I think it's very difficult, at least from the outside, to imagine that $20,000 in back payment would be sufficient to drive a man to this kind of murder. Even granting the enormous frustration that one must have. I mean, the irony of requiring someone to pay child support and then when they don't pay it, removing their welding license, which would be how they would earn money to pay the child support. People confront those things every day through our criminal justice system. We don't see those typically as motives for murder.
And look, earlier before the prosecution was trying to say, look, if there was a gentleman, a friend of his, who was trying to get him a high-paying job overseas, but he couldn't go overseas to get that job because of these child support payments. Again, another reason. So the idea here that you have these kinds of conflicting narratives, is it that? Is it the drug cartel? I mean, you tell me, the idea of the state going after Henry Segura, when there seems to be all of this other stuff going on, what is it that they're holding on to? Why do they think he did this? Is it because he lied to them? Is it because he had a separate phone? Is it because he tried to mislead them about what he's doing? What is it that the state really believes that ties Henry Segura to this quadruple homicide?
So one has to hope that the state truly believes it, because otherwise it'd be a deeply unethical thing to do. I think that prosecutors, just like the rest of us, are often victims of, or the beneficiaries of, our own kind of very subjective instincts about what's going on. Clearly, there are things that Segura did here that would not only give suspicion, but that what might make one think that he is hiding things. The second phone, the lies. There are lots of reasons why a person might lie. What tends to happen for all of us, whether we're right or wrong about the facts, is we tend to develop a narrative for ourselves and we stick with it. And it would be really, really upsetting if you found out, for example, if you were a police officer or a prosecutor, that you had stuck with a narrative about an innocent man. And so there's some, I think, sort of psychological tendency we all have to keep believing the story we have, the narrative we have, to justify what we're doing. Because I promise you, no prosecutor in this case woke up in the morning and said, hey, I want to go convict an innocent person.
Yeah.
They believed something about Mr. Segura. They've latched onto it. And as much as to the outside, it may seem not terribly plausible. I think that they have convinced themselves, and perhaps they will convince this jury, that those moments of deception that we see from Mr. Segura are sufficient to demonstrate not just motive, but intent, that he's covering something up here.
Tie it to the fact that he was there the day of, and does it make sense that he be lying to police in a quadruple homicide investigation because he didn't want to be caught in having an affair? Well, we'll talk more about it. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live.